Hey everyone, my name is Michael Seiger and I'm the founder and publisher of iSixSigma.com, the largest community of Lean and Six Sigma professionals in the world. At iSixSigma.com, we champion the idea that breakthrough process improvement can be accomplished by anyone within an organization. When I think of implementing Lean at an organization, I think of a methodology to reduce waste and empower employees or people doing the job to do the right thing. A classic example that we've all heard of before is the Toyota production system. Lean can involve tools like 5S and process mapping, but to me, the methodology gets a little amorphous at that point. So today I've invited on a guest that's going to help us understand the Lean methodology better, especially as it relates to small teams. Today's questions include: how do small teams implement Lean? What does Lean look like? And what are the benefits, both top-line growth and bottom-line savings? Joining us to answer these questions is Jim Benson. Jim is the CEO of Modus Operandi, a collaborative management consulting company based in Seattle, just across Puget Sound from iSix Sigma headquarters here on Bainbridge Island. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Jim, let me start with the bottom line up front. If someone were to invest the time to watch this full interview, what would they get out of it? How can Lean help small teams?
So when we're talking about small teams, one of the things that we're mostly talking about is small teams of knowledge workers. Mm-hmm. And the implementation of Lean into the manufacturing sector is very well documented. Mm-hmm. But when you get into knowledge work, it gets a little bit more amorphous. And so what I think we're going to cover today is how we can plug Lean principles into knowledge working teams and give them more clarity into their work, more ability to estimate effectively, plan effectively, and then communicate more effectively with the rest of the organization. When we go back to Deming's profound knowledge, one of the main things in the profound knowledge is understanding variation. And for small teams, especially for knowledge workers, there's a high degree of variation. And I think that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today.
Definitely. Okay. And so, that makes sense to the small team. But if somebody wants to, talk to their managers and say, hey, we want to do this because we're knowledge workers, we work on this team, mm-hmm. we want better communication, we want, shorter cycle times, we want improved processes. What can management expect by supporting this type of Lean implementation in small teams in terms of hard savings?
Okay. Right now, a lot of the waste that is inherent in knowledge work comes from a fundamental lack of understanding about what's involved in knowledge work. Mm-hmm. And that's on the part of the knowledge worker, the team that the knowledge worker is on, and the people who are managing those knowledge workers. One of the things about if we have an assembly line and there's widgets moving down that assembly line, we can visibly see when that line is at capacity. Mm-hmm. When you start running into the Lucy and Ethel at the chocolate factory problems where there's just chocolates everywhere, that's a visible thing. You can see that. But you can't see when someone's head's overloaded. And people do have actual capacities. And so what we want to do is provide some visual controls and some tools and some mechanisms to communicate to everybody involved what's going on at any given point in time and when people are reaching their capacity. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, if I approach you as a boss and I just have like a 10-minute task and I give it to you, I say, here's your 10-minute task, and then I come back in 30 minutes and you're not done, I am annoyed because it was only a 10-minute task.
Right.
I have no ability to actually see into what you are doing, so I can't respect what you're doing because I just simply don't know. And when that is understood by everybody involved, you also start to understand things like, yesterday that task took me 10 minutes. Today when I did that identical task, it took me a half an hour because there's a high degree of variation in my work. Well, that 3x difference is very, very disruptive to your ability to plan out your day, to your ability to estimate effectively, and so forth. So if I'm a boss and I'm saying, how long is that project going to take you? I'm asking you to estimate that with no knowledge of what variation is going to come up. And then we're all upset when that goes offline. And we can talk more about that as we go on.
No, definitely. And I, have attended one of your training sessions at a Seattle tech startup presentation that you gave in Seattle. And so I understand how it all fits together. But do you have any, and that makes perfect sense that we're going to get into all those tactics. But before we move on, do you have any data? Have you read any research? Do you have any maybe not data on it, but any situations that you've experienced where you've implemented lean in small teams and you've actually seen productivity increases, more work output from knowledge workers as a result of doing the lean and seeing the process and having better communication and not overloading people in their head, just like you decide?
So there's two standouts for me, but there's a lot of examples. Excuse me. The first is a team of support staff that I worked with a company in West Virginia. And there were 24 people on what they called the support team. And this team had a backlog of 2,000 tickets. And that wasn't so bad because they were doing about 250 tickets a day. The problem was that they were taking in 250 tickets a day. So they had no ability to any variation at all went more into the backlog. The backlog grew and grew and grew. When we first started discussing their team, said, what are you doing to lower the number of tickets that you have? And the response back was, well, we're all trying to go through more tickets. So they had a daily award, daily tracking of who did the most tickets. Psychologically, that destroyed everybody because everybody was fighting with each other to do the easy tickets, or they were upset because they got a hard ticket and that was going to drive their numbers down. They would, prematurely end calls and things, or worse yet, for morale, they would actually do a good job. So the metric was saying, you have to do as many tickets as possible. Right. As good professionals, they were staying on the phone for 4 or 5 hours with really sticky problems. At the end of the day, they did 2 tickets, and then they would get in trouble for doing a good job. So the problem with that is that team it was what I call a bowling team. Everybody was out there trying to bowl as hard as they could, but they weren't a football team. They weren't a baseball team. There was no collaboration going on that allowed them to enjoy the benefits of putting multiple minds on a problem, or by taking a group of work and figuring out ways to increase the throughput of it. So what we did was we ended up dividing them into teams of 6, and then those teams were had a visual control, and they were highly focused on team dynamics, and that ended up making the organization overall, in the course of about 6 months, get down to about 700 tickets in the backlog. After they did that, and the cool thing about that was while they were doing that, they were constantly going through Kaizen exercises. Their teams met in what agile methodologies call a stand-up meeting. So for 15 minutes every morning, they would meet in their individual teams, but then representatives of those teams would go to what they called a Deming team meeting. And that team would say, here's the continuous improvement exercises that we did yesterday. What are we going to do today? Here's the results that happened. So they were doing plan, do, check, act every single day because their problem was that big. And again, this is a team that's in the middle of West Virginia. It's made up of incredibly dedicated professionals who, before we started this, absolutely hated their jobs. At the end, and this is the bigger metric for me, at the end, they all really liked their jobs because they were allowed to be effective.
Right.
And when we move into the software world, so a lot of teams that we work with are software teams, especially in organizations where your company doesn't really do software, but but it has a software group, which is like almost every company now. But the problem is that since your processes are geared towards manufacturing or finance or healthcare or whatever, relating to IT is traditionally very difficult. So what we've noticed, I'm trying to think of a specific example, teams that implement visual controls and begin to understand what their variation is, understand how the team learns, understand psychology. So basically going through all of the steps of Deming's profound knowledge, they're better able to communicate to the rest of the organization. I can give another example that's actually an anti-example.
Okay.
So we had one client that was a large company that was traditionally extremely top-down and wasn't geared for Kaizen events in any way, shape, or form. So when we started the project, we went to upper management and said, look, you've hired us to come in and teach your people to be autonomous. And we're worried that this isn't, the culture of this company isn't autonomous. Right. And they said, no, it's exactly, we know this is what we need. We know this is what we want to do. So we worked with the teams. The teams went through a couple of Kaizen exercises, and they basically reorganized themselves so that they could be more effective. The numbers that I was getting back was their effectiveness went up somewhere between 200 and 300%.
Wow. Okay, so we're seeing effectiveness of teams going up as a result of multiple benefits going on. The employee morale is increasing because they are actually able to control their destiny and make those changes that allow them to be more productive. And and then as a result, their output is increasing. They're either reducing their caseload or they're getting more work products out. And at the end of the day, the customers are then more satisfied because they're being handled more quickly. They're getting a better product.
And the funny thing about that is that when you make professionals visibly aware of the impediments to them doing a good job, and that sits up there on a visual control that just stares at them all day long, it becomes intolerable for them to allow that to go on. So waste reduction is a byproduct of lean. It should not be the focus of lean. The focus of lean is to know what's going on. And then when you learn that, you will start to do continuous improvement exercises, which, if successful, will by definition reduce appropriate amounts of waste. Now, conversely, reducing waste can lead to really bad process. So if you're lean focused, and this is the problem with a lot of upper management or people who come to lean from a cost-cutting standpoint, as opposed to what you described earlier, which is more of a understanding of work, understanding why we're here and why we're building what we are. If we have faith in people as professionals, which I think is pretty much entirely what Deming wrote about, that's where the real savings comes in. That's where waste, that's where Muda, Murray, and everything else, that's where it disappears.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm excited to get into the specifics because I think a lot of people, they quickly summarize Lean or Six Sigma and differentiate the two from themselves by saying, Lean reduces waste and Six Sigma reduces variation. And it's more than that. And so that's why I'm excited to get into this interview in detail. But first, let me take a step back and ask you a little bit about your background. When did you first discover the benefit of using Lean in small teams?
Okay. Well, I'll go back further than that. So I started off in psychology. And as I was going through university, I kind of looked around and I was like, wow, if I get a degree in this, these guys are going to be my peers. And I wasn't sure that I wanted that. So I went into urban planning and I built giant things. So I built freeways and light rail systems, subways, neighborhoods and so forth, and got an appreciation for what it was like to manage gigantic things that were made up of bunches of different components. So to have massive team, and then smaller teams and teams within those teams, and understanding that from the individual all the way up, everybody had different information needs. At one point, I became frustrated with urban planning because my government clients were sometimes actually policy bound to destroy the work that we'd done. So I could not, if I went out and gathered a whole bunch of geographic information for a region on a project, a lot of my projects had line items in there that said, you cannot save this information. You have to give it back to the government. And so there were a few times in there where I had back-to-back projects with an agency. I would go out and gather a whole bunch of information, give it to the government, and then later on they'd say, go out and collect it again. And I'd say, but I just gave it to you. They'd say, yeah, we killed it. We don't know where it is.
Right. And
so I made a software company that was designed to make collaborative software for government that made them better stewards of their data. And we actually did a pretty good job. So we were around for about 10 years. And during that time, we were what was called an agile shop. And so to software development, agile is kind of the lean of software development. Until now, we've really introduced lean for real into software development. And agile taught a couple of things that were antithetical to government contracts. So you needed to do rapid release. So about every 2 weeks, we would show up with a new release. It would be fully realized. You could have discussions based on it. The method of contracting was that when you got to that thing, you could, migrate your software development based on what the feedback was. Well, all of that flew in the face of a rigid scope, which is how government usually operates. So we had to get very good at selling this. Mm-hmm. And there were a few key components that weren't working well for us. And one of them was a central tenet of most agile methodologies, which is something called an iteration or a sprint. Mm-hmm. And that's, like I just said, every 2 weeks you release something. Mm-hmm. When that realization hit us, there was a huge lean community, agile community, which had its processes very well set. I will not say dogma, but by not saying that I'm not saying dogma, I'm saying dogma. And we kept bouncing up against that, and we went off in search of other mechanisms that we could augment our agile practices with that would help us out. And then we basically discovered lean through the concept of flow, basically. Mm-hmm. We wanted to set up a system where people could visualize what was happening across the team or teams. We could see the flow of work. And when we started doing that, we suddenly realized, 2-week interruptions in work is waste. Because you have to have a beginning and an end to every 2-week cycle, and they're arbitrary constructs. Mm-hmm. And that was basically our introduction. A guy named Don Reinertson in Southern California introduced the concept of Kanban to my friend David Anderson. He and I started discussing this. He went off to work at that with it at Microsoft, and I was working with it at my company. And we both started noticing very immediate results. Mm-hmm. And then it wasn't long after that before we were digging into Womack and Jones and Deming and everybody saying, what else is in here?
Right. Great. And so your current business, I love the business name, modus operandi. Mm-hmm. I think people can understand modus operandi means, a particular way of doing something. That's mm-hmm. my MO. Yep. Why did you choose modus operandi as your business name?
Well, ultimately, there are significant waste reduction, cost savings, quality improvements when we collaborate. Mm-hmm. 2 people working on something produce better product than 1 person working on something. They may or may not produce it faster than people working in parallel, mm-hmm. But usually they do. And the quality improvements of having multiple eyes on something, multiple hands on something, people actually interested in what you're doing, that increases quality, reduces waste, and also, because we are social animals, makes us happier when we're at work. So the more that I go and toss Dilbert into a cube and say, don't talk to anybody, just get your work done, the lower the quality of product I'm going to get, and it's going to keep decreasing over time because that person is going to feel more and more distant from the work that's actually being done. The other thing is that there's cooperation between levels in an organization. So one of the problems that we had in Agile is that the rhetoric was Agile's kind of a liberation theology for coders. And very important, software would be decades behind where it is now if Agile hadn't come along. But before Agile, coders were incredibly mistreated because, again, no one could see what was going on in their heads, so they just kept tossing more and more work on them. Agile provided a mechanism for them to put some limits on that, to start to limit their work in progress. And that's what we've continued on with Kanban, but we're continuing in a collaborative model that not only says inside the team this is what's happening, but says up and downstream, this is what we're working on. You guys can see it because it's on the wall, or it's on the screen, or wherever the Kanban is. You can see it. Come stop us if we're insane. And the conversations then become less people showing up in your cube and saying, what are you doing? But I see you're doing this. Let's have a conversation about it. So you start from activity. You don't start from an open-ended query.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk about lean for small teams, which is applicable to a subset of lean for software development, but I don't want to make this software development focused. We're going to talk about lean for small teams. We're going to talk about personal Kanban, visual management, and that's all great. But let me take a step back and get you to define a term for me. Sure. What is lean?
What is lean is kind of like what is love or what is quality or some things that Supreme Court justices couldn't quite get down. So for me, when I kind of deconstruct lean, and I would like to think that Jim Womack would agree with me on this, is that I liked your definition at the beginning, that lean is about respect for the people that you're working with and for the teams, and for a single-minded drive toward better conditions. And that may be quality improvement. It may be quality of life improvement. So, I can do all sorts of things to improve the quality of the product, but if it makes the working conditions more dangerous, then it's going to be self-defeating. So there's different levels of quality. So I keep coming back to Deming's system of profound knowledge, and those things are, the appreciation of a system, knowledge of variation, the theory of knowledge itself, and then, of course, the psychology aspect of it. And for me, that last psychological component when we're dealing with small teams and when we're dealing with knowledge workers is imperative. Because just like you're not going to operate a non-lubricated lathe, you shouldn't be going and destroying the morale of people whose entire output for you comes out of their heads.
Right.
Because if people feel lousy, they will produce bad thinking. They will stop thinking. They will shut down. So, if they're like lousy increments, every lousy increment you add on is actual destruction of value for the organization.
Sure. And there have been organizational studies that have proven that if workers bring their outside personal life to work, that they're less productive. If they have health issues, they're less productive. And that's why a lot of forward-thinking companies are offering these, human resource plans that help the employees feel more comfortable, take care of their personal issues on their personal time, help them manage their health issues so that they can have more happy and healthy employees at work so they can get more productivity out of them. So it's the same sort of relationship.
Well, and also to understand that there is a very close linkage between effectiveness and productivity for knowledge workers. And so I need to, as an employer, I need to understand that when, the bell rings, it's not Fred Flintstone, jumping off of, his brontosaurus and going home and saying yabba dabba do. That people actually go home and keep thinking about their work. Mm-hmm. Conversely, when people come to the office, they don't stop thinking about their lives. So, providing ways to elegantly allow people to be human while they're at the office is huge. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, like, let's say that you have your Kanban set up for your personal work, and in there's a WIP limit of like 3 things that you can be working on at a time. But there's something in your personal life that's really bothering you. Mm-hmm. You should be able to walk up to the whiteboard and scribble that thing out and put up a 2, and just let your coworkers know, I'm dealing with some stuff, and I might not be as pleasant today as I normally am.
Yeah.
And some places that works better than others. Uh-huh. The one thing that we have noticed, though, is that when we have people, when they finish a task, annotate that task with some indication of how they felt when they were finished with it. So we usually use like smiley faces or angry faces, or and people can get very creative with what they put on there. But if you get to the end of a day and you look at the completed column and you see that everything up there, everybody's angry, and you can even see this after 2 or 3, things go by, then something's wrong. So for knowledge workers, disposition is a leading indicator of future quality problems or cost overruns or things like that. So you say, why are you guys upset? Very seldom will you have a whole group of people upset because of something external to the group. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Kind of strayed from what Lean was.
And I've actually got my personal Kanban set up on my office wall on the other side of this wall over there. And it's great. I've got a lot of things in my queue. I've got 4 things that I'm working on because, I'm a major multitasker, even though I'm probably not as effective. I've got 4 things and I've got my done. And it's a great way for me to visualize what's going on every single day and what's important in my life versus what comes up every day. And actually, I was having a conversation with one of my entrepreneur friends that runs a customer relationship management software system, phenomenal product, over in Seattle yesterday. And he picked up the phone. He was talking to his development team, and they were talking about the same sort of thing. What are the personal emotions that you're feeling when you're working on this item for this release or for just completed it? And I got to listen to him interact with the CTO and development team about that. And, for knowledge workers, it's very important because something may have been completed, but somebody may not be happy with it. And just checking a box on a database that has a, interface for the headquarters office over in a different state, let's say, is not indicative of what's going on in your organization.
Right.
So we'll talk about that. But let me ask you one more question regarding what is Lean. Jim, can people look at it as a framework? Can they look at it as a series of steps that need to be completed in order to make sure that the right things are being done in order to have a more effective Lean organization?
So, yes and no. For me, when we start to get into finite steps, we start to come up with rules. And the more rules that we come up with, the more rigid our system becomes. And the more rigid our system becomes, the more it doesn't tolerate variation. So for personal Kanban, we only have 2 rules, and that's visualize your work and limit your work in progress. And again, because if people see what the problems are, that will drive the quality improvement. There are implied rules beneath that, which is you should be continuously improving. But the understanding is that that pull system isn't just a pull system of work. There's also a pull system of quality.
Right, but that's an
And
individual tool. Kanban
Yeah.
is one tool that fits under the lean
yeah,
umbrella, right?
right.
So
Exactly.
can you refer to lean as a methodology or a framework that includes a bunch of tools that you may or may not use depending on the exact work conditions?
May or may not is exactly the phrase I was looking for.
Okay.
So, if there were steps, I would say that the steps would be something like become aware of your work, stay aware of your work, and then try and become better at your work continuously. And here is a wide range of really amazing tools. Here's A3. Here's the here's different question and answer mechanisms. Here's appreciative inquiry. Whatever it is that you want to employ. One of the problems is, and this is true for Lean, it's true for Six Sigma, it's true for Agile, it's true for A3, it's true for everything that is a process. People try to apply that process rigidly where it doesn't belong, then it doesn't work there, and then they claim the process to be a failure.
Right.
But what's actually a failure is a lack of understanding about how you as a team or you as an organization create value and what your customers want.
Right.
And if you understand those two things via any of these mechanisms, then you can apply any of these other mechanisms to solve problems when they come up.
And you just described the, paramount issue facing corporations on any large scale implementation,
Right.
whether it's Lean, whether it's Six Sigma, whether it's an ERP system. If you do it wrong, if you're not implementing it in the way that the business needs it, it's going to fail. And then people are always going to say, well, we tried that before. We're never going to use that again.
If you're not doing something thoughtfully, then you're not doing something thoughtfully. That's the end result. So ERP is an amazing example for that because so many people thought two things. One, it's out of the box, which ERP is never out of the box.
Never.
And then number two, that the professionals, the SAP professionals or whoever, they can come in and solve all of our problems for us. And that's not the way it works because they'll only know your problems in how you relate that story to them. You have to be the introspective business owner. Maybe you hire a consultant to come in and help you become more introspective, but you don't expect other people to come in and overnight figure out exactly the way everything works culturally and systematically in your organization.
Right. Exactly. Okay, so we're talking about Lean for small teams, and it's a methodology framework, including a bunch of tools, and overall, you want to measure what you're doing, analyze it for improvement, and then improve it. That's the goal of Lean, but small teams is a little amorphous to me. How do you define a small team? Is it 2 people? Is it 10 people?
Small team is also it's a catch-all. And one of the things for identifying what a small team is how simultaneously independent and dependent are the actors on that team. So initially, that group of support staff that we were working with, they called themselves a team, but they were actually just employees. But the moment that we developed the sub-teams, not only did they become team members in the sense that they were actually on a 6-person team, but they also became team members in that those teams related to each other as one large support team now. The green team, the red team, the yellow team, the blue team, they all knew what their role was in relation to the other teams. So it gave them definition and it gave them clarity. The people on those teams had a lot of discretion in how they handled their own personal work and how they drove the work for their teams. If you have a group of people that are only receiving orders from above, that's a group of people receiving orders from above. It is not a team. Now, the word small can go, can anywhere from an individual, up to 50, 60 people, depending on how all of those people are interacting. But I think that there's more of a systemic or a functional definition than there is a numeric definition for what a small team is.
Okay, but we're talking about a team that, so it may be anywhere from 1 to 50 people that is going to use the steps that we're going to talk about next, and they're going to organize their work around that.
And I can actually tell a little story around that.
Yeah.
There's a rule in agile methodologies that say that the ideal team size is 8 people, because that's kind of a human relationship, human dynamic limit. When we introduced at a large company here in Seattle, a Kanban, they had 50 developers. And we were able to use the visual control as the focal point for the group, which allowed the cognitive load of understanding what everybody else was doing a lot less, which meant that those 50 people could get together. They could have a daily stand-up meeting in 15 minutes that actually covered everything that all 50 people were doing. Part of that division is that if small teams aren't, so small team is going to be defined in the size of the team where everybody knows what's going on. So the more tools that you can give to provide that clarity, the larger your small team can be.
All right, that's a great way to define it, Jim. So before we get into implementation, tell me, how does lean for small teams differ from lean manufacturing like the Toyota way, from lean services like lean healthcare that we hear so much about nowadays, and from lean startup popularized by Eric Ries?
Okay. You do know this is a long answer, right?
Yes, I do. But I want to compare all three just so people get a better clarity in their own minds.
Absolutely. So with lean manufacturing, we have a history, a long history of proven results based on the optimization of, and some people might criticize me for this, but based on rather predictable events. So there's a model called the Kneffen model, which talks about the complexity of an environment. And there are 4 major sections along this continuum. It's drawn kind of in quadrants, but it's more of a continuum. And the simple part of that is simple stuff. And simple stuff is I put in a certain amount of energy and I get out a widget. And that happens all the time. And my optimization of that is how can I put in less energy to provide the same widget?
Right.
Or can I change my processes to do that? And I believe it's somewhere that Deming's definition of quality was something like the amount of work costs or work efforts that you have divided by total costs. So a fairly mechanistic system. And in that simple domain, we can apply best practices. Because a best practice is something that I can do over here, and I can give it to you in your company, and you can do exactly the same thing because this is a simple system. Above that is the complicated system. And the complicated system has a higher degree of variation, and you can apply what are called good practices, which are like best practices with more leeway. That's the ordered side. That's the lean manufacturing side. Manufacturing should never get over into the unordered side. So for teams, we're dealing a lot with the unordered side, and I'll get to that in a little bit. For lean services is awesome, and it's kind of what we're doing. But the enactment of lean services was largely flavored by lean manufacturing, without bringing in the psychology of work or fully understanding, I believe, the unique role of variation for knowledge workers. So it got a bad rap because people were coming in and they were trying to implement rigid systems that didn't belong. So the checklist manifesto style management for specific operation procedures in an ER is awesome. The checklist manifesto across the board in in a healthcare organization is awful, because there's a lot of listening and a lot of emotional feedback that doctors get that you can't put down, like the check mark. Did you get your emotional feedback? Did you work appropriately with that emotional feedback? So what I've been seeing in lean healthcare is, and the other services, is that's becoming apparent, and that basically in the continuous improvement of the lean services themselves, that's becoming a lot better. The lean startup world is interesting because that's applying lean techniques to entrepreneurs, which are almost chaotic. You know, they have crazy ideas and they want to go out and do their crazy ideas.
Sure.
And so before Eric Ries wrote Lean Startup, what people tended to do was they would have an idea and then they would go out and build it, like the whole thing.
Right.
That ended up not serving a lot of startups very well. It ended up burning through a lot of money. Yeah. And so the lean startup concept is borrowing something from Agile. Agile had the minimal viable feature, or minimal marketable feature. And Eric borrowed that and created the minimal viable product. And basically what that is I've got an idea and I really believe in it and I'm smart. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to create this minimal viable product as quickly as I possibly can. I'm going to release it to the market as quickly as I possibly can. Maybe I make money from it, maybe I don't, but I get back feedback right away. So you set up feedback loops right away. And Eric kind of set up a plan, do, check, act kind of thing, which is build, measure, learn. And what the benefit of that is it's starting to bring the scientific management model to what was previously an entirely chaotic, unmanaged system. Lean Startup doesn't yet, it will, but it doesn't yet address the actual production systems. So this is more of a testing your hypothesis for a product. So this is applying lean to the product development process, not necessarily the product creation process.
Right.
And so what's nice about that is that we end up working a lot with lean startup groups now, because people are recognizing, okay, I really understand my customer, but I still don't know how I'm building the software.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So there are tools from the original lean manufacturing that have flowed forward into lean for services, that have flown forward into lean startup. A lot more database decision making across all three, a lot more structured form to implementing it, although you pick and choose what may or may not be an appropriate tool to use at whatever phase in the process you are. And a general methodology like Six Sigma, define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. Lean, you have a 3-step, maybe it's PDCA. Same as in lean startup, or similar as in lean startup. So that's how they sort of all compare, even though there are variations to them.
Right. And one of the things is there's a concept called shuhari, which is basically that you're at a kind of a learning stage, or you're at an incorporation stage, or you're at a synthesis stage, if you will. And one of the issues is it's very hard to describe to people the synthesis stage before they've gone through the first two. And when you're going through the first two, you're learning, this comes from martial arts. So, you're learning how to kick, you're learning how to block, you're learning how to do all of these things. And while you're learning those, there's a right way. When you get to the synthesis stage, there's no longer a right way. You can do it any way you want as long as you're successful. But as thousands of people have come through, like the black belt process, or in Agile into the Scrum Master process, they get to stage 2 and they freeze. And so one of the hardest things as a lean practitioner is to understand that the notion of lean says that our ideas are always wrong, that things can always be improved. And so improving lean becomes as hard as it was for the Agile community to expect that maybe there was some improvements that we could make to Agile.
Yeah.
That's one of the hardest things about selling this into a company, because people who are buying want to buy a product, just like the ERP people want people to come in and solve their problems.
Right.
And what the product actually is teaching the organization to not have to buy any more products like this.
Right. To always be self-improving themselves.
Yes.
Exactly. All right, so let's talk about nuts and bolts, Jim. How is lean for small teams implemented? What are the steps?
Okay. What we do generally, trying to think of a way to not talk about this in the first person, but
so let me preface that by asking, can lean be implemented step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 differently at 5 different consulting companies that you go and ask?
Probably, yeah, because everybody has their own methodology. So Jim Womack's methodology is to go in and then say, I would like to walk the Gamba, and then he goes out and he walks the Gamba. Gamba walks are fun. It is a riot. It is so much fun. But one of the issues is when you move into knowledge work is the Gemba, like I said, it's no longer a series of steps on an assembly line. It's just a bunch of people sitting in a room.
Yeah.
And so, walking the Gemba would be like walking a circle around a bunch of cubes.
Or trying to get in somebody's head.
That's right.
Right. Okay. So it's different for any type of organization. Just like
right.
Implementing Six Sigma at any type of organization may look differently. It may be a top-down deployment where the CEO says, we will do this like Jack Welch, or it may be a bottoms-up where just a software development group may say, we want to do this, or just an HR group may say, we want to do this. So having said that, I'm asking you what your process steps are. Okay. So what are the steps for implementing lean within small teams from your perspective?
From my perspective, the initial process, it almost sounds like a 12-step program, is to admit that you have variation. I am Jim, and I have variation. And that's not a bad thing, that is endemic to the work. And that's hard for a lot of professionals to accept.
Sure. And what might that variation look like? If I'm doing, I don't want to talk about software development. Let's say that I am processing loans. What might that variation look like if I'm the ones actually reviewing the details of the loan, running my analysis on credit worthiness, things like that, determining at the end of the process whether they are approved or not?
Right. So let's divide that up into a couple of sections. So the first section would be variation based on failure demand. Failure demand is John Seddon's concept that we often create our own waste by building systems that have failure inherent in the system. So when I was in college, I got a temp job in the middle of the night processing loans. And I was the only person in the bank in the middle of the night sitting there in this lonely room processing loans. And probably 3 loans out of 5 didn't have all of the information on them. So I had to kick those back. So that was kind of failure demand number 1. Failure demand number 2 was, I think, pretty much once every 3 days, the fax machine would stop communicating with the fax machine on the other side.
Right.
Then you would have to do a bunch of stuff and then wait. I never did find out what was going on, but then there was like that mechanical, failure demand.
Right. Okay, so all of those failure demands are variation that occurs within the day-to-day process of doing that job. It could be related to the specific tasks, like, hey, they left this field blank, so now it's an exception. I need to kick it back, and it's going to re-enter the process again. Or,
Right.
I drank too much coffee and I got to go to the
Yep.
bathroom, or the fax machine doesn't work, or the boss keeps emailing me, or just all these sources of variation that are going to affect how well I do my job.
And from the other side of that, it was frustrating for both the loan recipient and the loan officer.
Sure.
Because they were kicking stuff to me where literally my work was 15 minutes alone, and because of the failures, things could be delayed 2, 3, 4 days for 15 minutes worth of work.
Right.
So there's that type of failure. There's that type of variation. There's also the variation where let's get out of a processing mode like that, but let's say that I'm writing an environmental impact statement for a construction project, and I'm writing away, and all of a sudden I find out that there's a situation where the data that I've been given can give me two conclusions. They're two completely logical conclusions, and the only way I can find that out is to gather more data and or talk to other people. That has changed that is variation. And so ordinarily writing that section might take me an hour. Now it takes me question mark. And that inventive data-driven process is highly susceptible to that, not only for me, but for all of the inputs to me. So I might say, okay, I'm going to write this on June 3rd. It's going to take me 2 days. And then on June 3rd, I get there and I only have 75% of my data because of upstream variations.
Right.
And then, I, of course, am late, and then that causes variations downstream.
Sure. All right, Jim, I want to be respectful of your time because you're so generous to come here and walk us through. And so I don't want to necessarily have to go through too many examples to exhibit what the steps are, because we just want to make people aware of the overall steps. I think a lot of people that read I6 Sigma are educated, or we have additional resources that they can go to better understand the individual steps. If there are 12 steps, I don't know if there are or not.
Okay, so to get back to that,
so step one is understanding or admitting that there is variation in the process.
Right. The second step is recognizing that the people on the team are all professionals, and that their goal in life is to do a good job. And yes, there will sometimes be people on your team whose goal it is not to do a good job. And there's a quick remedy for that.
Fire them.
But there ordinarily, when we don't recognize that, we blame systemic problems on people.
Right.
And then we come to the conclusion that people routinely do a bad job. But in almost every instance that I've found, it's been a systemic problem. It hasn't been an individual problem.
Yep. And in Six Sigma, we teach it's the process, not the people.
Yes.
So, yep.
And the that's kind of a Mobius strip statement. Because it's the problem, it's not the people, but it's the process, but it's not the people, but it's not the process. The people need to, I like to say that in knowledge work, we've moved from walking the Gamba to Gamba activation. And so when we understand that we kind of end up in a Marshall McLuhan situation where now the people are the process, because the team itself is responsible all the time for its own process improvement, for its own Kaizen events, for its own remedial actions, measuring, acting, the whole bit. Now it's the people and the process, and they are one.
Okay.
And marrying that group directly empowers everybody over the entire value stream, as opposed to the silo of their station.
Right, that makes sense. All right, let me ask you for a couple of definitions, Jim, because I'm not sure if they're in the I6 Sigma dictionary, so I'm going to give you credit for them.
Okay.
Can you define Gamba for us?
Okay. So Gamba is, in TPS, Gamba is the crime scene. It is the place where everything happens. And so when you do a Gamba walk, you go walk the line and you talk to the people on the line. You ask them what they're doing, how things are going, if they have any suggestions, if there are any problems that have come up, any solutions, and so forth. If there's a specific issue that's happened, you will go address the Gemba and say, hey, we're seeing these numbers coming back. How can we as a group fix them? So the Gemba as a concept was developed to respect the fact that line workers were actually professionals with brains that could give value to the company more than just turning things and shipping things along on a line.
Got it. And it's a Japanese word, if I
yes.
understand. Okay. So that's the definition of the Gemba, where work is done, and walking the Gemba is walking the line or walking the ER department or walking through human resources and talking to the people who are doing the work and respecting the fact that they do the job on a daily basis. They know what the problems are, and they're probably the best to solve them. Yes.
And so when you walk into the nursing department, for example, you will see a bunch of nurses. Maybe you can look at how they do paperwork. Maybe you can look at how the screens are located, and those are all good things. But those are all the built environment. Those are all manifestations of existing process.
Right.
And if you're looking for ways to improve, looking at the existing process may not be the best way to go, because you're only going to improve the existing process. You're not going to have any, radical new ideas.
Right.
With visual controls, one of the things that we're trying to do is create a Gemba. So in a place where previously there was none. So previously everything's happening in people's heads. Now we actually see on the board, these are the people, this is what's happening, this is what's being built, this is the stage that it's in, this is what's blocked, this is what's not blocked, this is a dependent on this task, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
That means that you can walk the Gemba, whereas it's a literal Gemba for manufacturing, this is more of a figurative Gemba, symbolic Gemba, but a very, very precise one. And value stream mapping is, I'm hesitant to say that it is something that I would demand, but it's very, very close to something that I would demand. And what I found with knowledge working teams is that when you map a value stream, the first reaction is everybody's annoyed that they have to come in and map the value stream because it's obvious. And then we sit down and I say, okay, if this is obvious, this is great. It'll only take 15 minutes, and then you can all go back. And so we write up the initial value stream, and I say, okay, so this is what happens. And everybody's like, yes. It's like every time.
Well, there was that one time, and suddenly your 15 minutes turns into 3 hours, and you've got people moving things around, and you've got exceptions to the rule, and you've got,
And so what happens there is that the team that you're meeting with recognizes that fundamentally they had different ideas of how value was created in the first place.
Right.
And that's wildly powerful.
And even what the definition of value is to whom, to the customer, to the company, to, definitely.
Exactly. And that's one of the other things is that in a lot of lean and agile rhetoric and lean startup rhetoric, there's this focus on value to the customer. And so you start to have dysfunction because you are pathologically focused on value to the customer, but you don't recognize things like the SEC actually should be paid attention to from time to time. You should probably do your bookkeeping even though it is not a final value to the customer, because if your company closes,
that's not a value to the customer
anyway.
Right, exactly.
So that's another kind of anti-pattern that I've noticed, is that people are like, I don't want to do that anymore because it's not value to the customer. It's like, well, it's a value to a customer, and that customer is the SEC.
Right. Okay. So step 1 was admitting variation in the process. Step 2 was recognizing that people on the team are professionals and they do want to do a good job. Step 3?
Let's go ahead and say that value stream mapping would actually be step 3.
Value stream mapping. So that's process mapping, and then actually determining what's value added, what steps are value added, and what steps are non-value added.
Right,
Okay.
right. And then for me, step 4 would be to actually start tracking work through that value stream and to have that be a participatory process. Bosses do not move work items. The person doing the work. So just like any Kanban, as the object moves through the system is moving the tickets.
Yeah.
The limiting work in progress is obviously going to be the next step, is to understanding that the more out of control your work in progress is, the higher your variation will be. The lower your quality will be, the more often you're going to miss deadlines. I keep coming back to Deming. At this point, and the reason that this hasn't been mentioned before, because it's Deming's point 1, and for me it's like 6, is that now everyone can see that there is a system.
Right.
So now we can appreciate that there is a system. If you start off by saying you guys are part of a system, they'll say things like, yeah, I'm part of a system and everything that breaks is his fault because he's the broken part of the system. So getting people to understand systems thinking by actually seeing the machine of work move along. And then I have 2 tools that I tend to use rigorously. And the first I mentioned already, which is the stand-up meeting. And that comes from Agile methodologies. And it's basically a 15-minute meeting that the team has every morning. And basically you talk about what's happening. Before having a Kanban, everybody would have to verbally say what they had done and what they're doing.
Right.
Since that's already handled on the Kanban, you can now talk about the flow of work, the structure of work, what's blocked, things like that. So you can have much more substantive conversations. You want that to be a short conversation, and if longer things come out of it, then people can peel off and go to those.
Right.
Ideally, if you can handle it, that's an awesome time to swarm on a problem. Where somebody says, I started this yesterday, I'm hung up on this, can you guys help out? And you get 5 minds on it in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
The second part of that is what Agile would call a retrospective, and what Lean would call a Kaizen event. To have regularly scheduled team meetings where you talk about the process, talk about continuous improvement, and make sure that continuous improvement is actually happening. And while it is possible to go through some points in time where continuous improvement is not happening right now, if that goes on for more than a couple of weeks, then you know that people aren't paying attention.
Yeah.
That would be my major steps. The training in the toolkit, which can include personal Kanban or A3 or 5S or any number of other things, and to understand the differences in the different loops that are out there.
Right. Sure.
So,
and I'm sorry, that makes perfect sense, because you've got the lean deployment planning and training, and then you've got the actual team training, which they then implement on a daily basis. And there's a difference between the organizational implementation and the team implementation. So
right.
I appreciate you bringing that up, that we're talking mainly about the team right here, and that if somebody wants to go implement a team, they can follow your 7 steps or so that we just went over. But there's probably more if they wanted to make their entire company more lean focused.
Right. And I would say that another, not necessarily a step, but a warning is never feel like your team is autonomous.
What do you mean by that?
When we draw up our value stream, then we create our own silo, and we don't recognize that there's business value up and downstream from us and concurrent. And that ends up creating single-focused, wasteful teams that don't collaborate across different parts of the organization.
Right.
And large consulting companies, you'll see this happen all the time. They will go out and get sub-consultants for things that are done in-house. because the company is so big and people so don't know what's going on that they don't even know that there are resources internally to turn to for those.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So, many times when I hear about lean for small teams, it's almost synonymous with lean for software development. But in your implementations, do you actually work with, how does it shake out in all of your implementations of all the companies that you worked with? How many are software teams doing lean, and how many are non-software teams?
I'd say 50% are software, and the other 50% are a wide range of other things.
Yep.
So we've worked with the UN, with the World Bank. We use these to write the Human Development Report for Vietnam a couple of years ago. And that was 0 software developers, all social scientists. We've adapted it to accountancies, to education, starting to work with healthcare on that. Pretty excited to get into that. And where I'm really excited in healthcare is not necessarily in like big lean healthcare, but in working with research groups or with sections of hospitals who are trying to track certain things about certain patients. And also just to make everybody in the organization or that portion of the organization more aware of what's happening, like in their pod.
Yeah.
I've worked very hard to keep a balance because IT is definitely the low-hanging fruit because everybody's very frustrated in and out of IT. IT is frustrated with everybody else, and everybody's frustrated with IT. But any improvement that we make to an IT group has to have a commensurate improvement to the rest of the organization. One of the clients that hired us, a huge company in England, they called us up and they said, we have a group of software developers and they're crazy and we can't make them do what we want. So we thought that the problem was that they weren't agile. So we sent them off and got them agile training. Now they're crazy 10 times faster. They're much more efficient at being crazy. Can you come in and either fix them or fire them? And so we said, okay. So we went in, and by and large, the team was fine. They were just getting conflicting requests from the rest of the organization, literally on an hourly basis. And so that ended up not being a software problem at all. It ended up being an interface problem between the rest of the organization and one part of the organization. So while it involved, while our credibility in software came into play there because we were able to stand on that and say, stop torturing these people, the actual remedies for that were all systemic outside of the software development part of it.
Yeah. All right. Let me look through my list of questions here. I had, if anybody has questions about Kaizen events, we have a lot of information on Six Sigma about that. We've defined Gambas. I'm going to ask you about Kanban. We talked about personal Kanban, which I think is great. I'm going to give a plug for you. Jim, I taped your presentation, like I mentioned earlier, on personal Kanban in Seattle. That's live on Six Sigma. If people want to watch that, I'm going to link to it from below this show. And also you can go to, on the right-hand side, in the main menu, you can go to tools and templates, and then you can also go to, and then Kanban's listed there, and you can see your video right there with the entire transcript and everything. And, but what if a team is distributed? What if you have people that are knowledge workers? They could be a software company. I'm here in Bainbridge. I've got my developer across the U.S. I've got another developer in India, let's say, or let's say that I run a financial organization where I don't care where people work. I know you're a knowledge worker. You're intelligent about processing loans. I'm going to hire you, and you're over in Seattle, and I'm down in Southern California. How can you use these type of tools? How do you make your process more lean when you have a distributed workforce?
Okay, so that goes back to the Kanban model. The more distributed your team, the less fidelity of communication that you have across members of that team. The more that fidelity is decreased, the more you're going to have to move your tasks back towards the simple domain of the Kneffin model. So simple tasks you can outsource anytime, any day, no problem, because they have a very set scope of work. You say, here's what you got to do. The person says, okay, they do it, and they hand it back. So typing the word hello, I can outsource that to anybody at any time that can type. The more that you move up into the complicated domain and into the complex domain, the more you're going to have communications issues. And that's not to say that you can't outsource complicated things. It's to say that once you do that, you need to have mechanisms in place to facilitate that level of communication. Mm-hmm. The first and most important one is to know those people individually. So one company that I work with in Tennessee, they are constantly flying people to India and flying their Indian outsourced people for extended stays in Knoxville. Mm-hmm. There are always people from India in the office in Knoxville. So that when they're having conversations overseas, those conversations aren't limited by culture, mm-hmm. and they aren't limited by unfamiliarity.
Right.
The quality that comes out of that company is phenomenal. It's mind-blowing how they've been able to do that. But that is a significant commitment that flies directly in the face of why most people think that they should offshore.
Right.
So, again, having an appreciation for the level of variation in our work, and as that becomes, the variation mm-hmm. goes up higher and higher and higher, and you get beyond complex or complicated and into complex, outsourcing becomes really, really difficult. The bizarre thing about most knowledge work is that it's all over the dial all the time. Mm-hmm. So me needing to fill my printer with paper is a simple task. That does not mean that my job is simple. Mm-hmm. So identifying the portions that are outsourceable based on the fidelity of communication is the way to have successful lean when you're outsourcing. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, you have to make a choice about whether your outsourced people or your distributed people are part of the team, or they're an external resource that you're drawing from. And if they're part of the team, then they need to be part of the Kaizen events. They need to be part of stand-up meetings. They need to have the identity that they are part of the team.
Yeah. And
the moment that identity starts to break down, your distributed team or your offshore team is going to break down as well.
Yeah. So, and I can see it in my head right now because I do have a distributed team, and I'm just walking through the 7 or so steps that we discussed, and I see them myself. And we do track our work through the value stream map. We do limit the work in progress, but we don't do stand-up meetings as an entire team. And so I can see how that would be useful for implementing today, and also doing Kaizen events on top of that, so that we can mm-hmm. improve how we work together. Mm-hmm. So fantastic, Jim. Let me ask you this as a final question. We talked about pitfalls that you've seen in your prior experience in implementing lean in small teams. We mm-hmm. talked about, one of the biggest pitfalls is that thinking that teams are autonomous, and they're not autonomous, that mm-hmm. they're, we don't want silos, and we don't want to just throw things over the wall and say we're done with mm-hmm. it. What other pitfalls have you seen, and how can they be avoided if somebody wants to think about implementing lean for small teams?
A whiteboard, but it's all the way over there with
I know how you like your whiteboards, Jim, so it's probably better that I can't get you over there.
So the anti-patterns they're rich and detailed on their own that we've managed to identify, but they can kind of be boiled down to a couple of things. One is fundamentally not understanding the nature of Kaizen. Mm-hmm. And the fundamental nature of Kaizen is that it's very Heraclitus, right? That the only thing that's constant is change. And so understanding that when we're going through a Kaizen event, there is nothing sacred. There is nothing that we can't take off the table. That's a hard one for people, and that gives birth to a lot of different anti-patterns. So the fundamental understanding that our goal in business is to stay in business, that outstrips just about everything else, and that we do that by producing quality products that people would like to actually purchase. And sometimes the product that we love doesn't give anybody value, or has been corrupted by the market.
Right.
It used to be a lot more profitable to be a pop star. The market has changed that. So now you have to have a line of clothing in addition to being a pop star. One of the other, I guess, root causes of these anti-patterns is not being honest about the amount of work that teams have in progress. And it is hard to be honest about your work in progress when you're a knowledge worker. You don't know when a meeting is going to show up. It's hard to put tickets on your Kanban for every meeting that comes up. Your phone can ring at random. People show up on chat. They show up on Skype. They show up. We are so eminently interruptible now that not understanding how to limit our work in progress is pretty huge. And then the third is by not being honest about what our true throughput is. And I try and get around this by using the visual controls to actually create real cycle time. And then recognizing that until you understand the ugliness of your cycle time, you're always going to be demoting certain tasks. You're always going to be late with things because you're never going to value the amount of time it actually takes you to complete stuff.
Right.
And people will discount. I've seen it happen a lot of times where will note the start time for a task and the end time for a task, and then when they get to the end, they'll rot it up and throw it away because they were interrupted.
Right.
Well, that interruption is a constant interruption. So there's a kind of a helper app that we use called the Pomodoro technique, and the Pomodoro technique says for 25 minutes. You take your task and you work on it for 25 minutes, and then when it's done, you're done. You put it back and you go for a walk or something. You try and do something physical. And what happens when you do that is while you're working, you're filling up your short-term memory. At the end of 25 minutes, you go for a quick walk. It doesn't matter even if it's in circles around your cube, but just get up and move your arms. When you do that, it moves that short-term memory into mid-term memory, so that you can file it into long-term memory when you go to sleep that night. If we tend to blast through the day, we tend to fill up our short-term memory and then we start losing stuff. So that type of focus also means that when you're in that 25-minute bubble, you've shut off your phone, you've shut off Skype, you've shut off everything that can interrupt you. You've put a note somewhere, like maybe on the back of your head if you're on a cube, saying, leave me alone for 25 minutes. So you get actual focus.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that we found that when we introduce the simple concepts up front, people feel so much better after doing that they come and they start looking for all of these secondary things that can make it even better. So one of the reasons why I was hesitant to list a whole bunch of steps is because our technique has always been to come in and give you as few steps up front as possible, and then let you kind of get in and swim around in that, and then expand that as you go along.
Yeah. That makes sense.
That's what we do.
All right, Jim, this is the point in the show where I urge the audience right now, if you received value out of this interview, and I know I did, take a moment to say thank you. It's as easy as posting a comment below the show, sending a tweet to @OurFounder. Is that right, Jim?
That is right.
OurFounder. I'll include a link below. Take a minute to do so. I'm going to say thank you again right now by mentioning the modus cooperandi website at moduscooperandi.com. I'm going to include a link below. On that site, you'll find some terrific information. You'll also find links to Jim's books that are listed on Amazon about Scrumban, personal Kanban, which I use in my day-to-day operations, and his other book, Why Plans Fail. And don't forget about Jim's other presentation that we've recorded on personal Kanban. You know, I like to download these, Jim, in MP3 format. I put them on my iPod. I listen to them while I'm working out or while I'm driving or, in a lot of different ways. And so I encourage people, there's more than just watching it on video. You can listen to it on MP3, or you can just download and read the transcript while you're, hanging out at night watching some TV. Jim Benson, CEO of Modus Cooperandi, thank you for coming on the Six Sigma Show, sharing your knowledge and helping others become more successful change agents and business leaders.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.